My name is Whit Mateau, and I'm joined today by Sam Libby. Sam and I work in our professional services group at Esri and get to work with many users like yourselves on a number of aspects of ArcGIS Enterprise. Today, we're going to be talking about migration strategies. So the agenda for today, we'd like to first define what we mean by migration projects. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the peripheral things that come into consideration with migrating ArcGIS Enterprise. We'll also get into a strategy for approaching a migration. And then hopefully relatively quickly here, get into the meat of the topic, which is looking at technical methods for migrating ArcGIS Enterprise. And we'll wrap with a little bit of an FAQ, if you will. We get a lot of different questions about migrations, and we'll cover a top 5 of the most frequently asked questions we get about migration. And then lastly, migrating is something that we see as part of a larger trend, which is really about taking your use of GIS or WebGIS to scale. And so as we wrap, we'll step back from migration and look at a few related recommendations to help you take your WebGIS to scale. So the term migration is a pretty general term. It's used in a number of different contexts quite validly. For example, it could be migrating from ArcMap to Pro, or even migrating ArcGIS Server to ArcGIS Enterprise. Here we're referring to enterprise and cloud migration, which is moving users, groups, and/or content from one GIS system to another, or one set of infrastructure to another, as sort of a one-time thing. You can see here in the graphic that often we start with ArcGIS Enterprise on premises and look to migrate to new infrastructure in ArcGIS Enterprise on premises, or ArcGIS Enterprise in the cloud, or ArcGIS Online. This isn't the full set of patterns. You may actually be starting with ArcGIS Enterprise in the cloud, or you may be looking to migrate from ArcGIS Online to ArcGIS Enterprise. We see a variety of patterns in this space. And actually, a lot of these migrations involve a number of other things. I mean, I think one thing we could think about here is that migrations, as we see them, are typically not lift and shifts where you want the thing in the target environment to look exactly like the thing in the source environment. We often see some tactical changes being made as part of the migration, which may include cleaning up content, so sort of organizing all of the users and groups and items and services that were created, upgrading as part of a migration, changing your publication strategy, meaning things like moving from map services to feature services or vector tile services, as well as making some small architecture changes. But often what we see as part of a migration is that users look at this as a bit of an inflection point, looking at the way they've been using GIS, assessing what's worked well and maybe what hasn't, and then pursuing changes as they look forward that gets them on a path to scale their use of GIS across the organization. You can see along the right here a few examples of the types of more modernization related changes that we see. For those users that are moving to the cloud, we often see them wanting to leverage platform as a service capabilities. We do often see more significant architecture changes coming into the target system. In a few cases, we may also be combining or splitting systems, implementing things like high availability, disaster recovery to achieve improved business continuity, and putting in place good governance practices for not just technology, but also people and process. So an important place to start as you think about migration is to really look at why you're looking to migrate. And we wanted to share here a few of the common reasons we see for our users looking to migrate, and in some cases specifically to the cloud. One is performance. In a lot of cases, you may be working on maybe not the most current or fastest machines and infrastructure, or you may be hampered by your ability to scale as usage grows. So by moving to new infrastructure, especially cloud infrastructure, you can take advantage of the latest and greatest machine types, as well as achieve higher levels of scalability and reliability. Another reason is cost. This is, I think, especially common with migrating to the cloud. Looking to maybe reduce your on-premises IT footprint and leverage more pay-as-you-go capabilities in the cloud. In some cases, you may want to take advantage of more capabilities. These could be sort of infrastructure capabilities, things like load balancing and elastic storage. It may also just be that you want to take advantage of more capabilities of ArcGIS Enterprise, like Notebook Server, and are unable to add more machines. And by moving to the cloud, you can more elastically create infrastructure and try out these different capabilities. And lastly, we do see security and compliance as being a big driver. This could be moving to a more secure enclave within your on-premises deployment, or in the case of cloud, leveraging things like FedRAMP, low, moderate, or high-based deployments to achieve that higher level of compliance. We also felt it was important to maybe highlight why we're talking about this today. Migration is not a new topic, but it's definitely one that's trending at the moment. We have some theories as to why. We have seen ArcGIS Enterprise adoption grow significantly over the last several years, and we see many users hitting that inflection point or otherwise wanting to move off of aging infrastructure and onto new infrastructure. We also see the cloud as having a moment today. Cloud has been around for a long time, but it's becoming increasingly rare that we see or work with users that are not already on the cloud, thinking about the cloud, or in the process of moving to the cloud. This is not to say that we're recommending you go to the cloud, but rather sort of reflecting what we see out there amongst many of you. Cloud is definitely popular, and increasingly organizations appear to be looking to move to the cloud. One other important point here is that migrations can be tricky. A big reason of that is that ArcGIS Enterprise is really quite flexible in terms of all of the different ways you can configure and deploy it. That means that there's not a one-size-fits-all pattern or practice for migrating, and we really need to approach migrations thoughtfully with a consistent approach, and we'll actually share one of those with you in just a moment. Before we do that, though, we did want to highlight some of the different nuance we see with some of these migrations. We highlighted a few of these a little bit earlier, but we wanted to go into a little bit more detail. We do see a demand for what we're referring to as partial migrations. This might be just saying, I want to move this set of services or this database to the cloud. In some cases, we see the need to combine multiple systems, or even to split a subset of a system into its own system. Maybe you're spinning off part of your business and it needs its own deployment of ArcGIS Enterprise. There has been a lot of improvements over the last several years around things like feature services and vector tile services, as well as feature layer views within ArcGIS Enterprise. And that's, I think, driving a lot of demand to change your publication strategy. So as you migrate, look to move from things like dynamic map services to feature services or vector tile services. When moving to the cloud, it's very common to take advantage of more platform as a service capabilities. This could be, for example, moving from a SQL server with software installed running on premises to using SQL Server database as a service, for example, RDS in Amazon Web Services. We do also see some other architecture changes typically come in. For example, moving from maybe web tier authentication with integrated Windows authentication to something like SAML. And we see a number of other considerations come into play when migrating. For example, looking to really minimize downtime, or develop the workforce in a way that allows you to operate at a level of business continuity that maybe you haven't before. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a picture as to the different types of things that often come up in migration. Um, what we wanted to do next is really give you a strategy, a high level strategy for how to approach migration. So this is a high level approach. I think the key message we'd like to communicate is that it's important to approach migration strategically and proceed thoughtfully. As the saying goes, understanding precedes action. And this idea of understanding, plan, and acting, and then revisiting, doing this iteratively, while high level, I think is important to keep in mind. And we're going to go into detail in just a moment on plan and act. But as we start with understanding, that often begins with the question why. Why are you looking to migrate? Where are you today? What is your current state? Where are you looking to go? What is your ideal target state? And what does success look like? What do you hope to achieve by getting there? As we get into plan and act, I think this is where the process gets quite a bit more detailed. We won't go through this in detail. Feel free to pause this here and review this in a little bit more detail. We think it's really important to understand the existing system, not conceptually, but at a very detailed level. What type of content do you have? How many users do you have? What are the different machines you have in your architecture? And basically to do an initial inventory and an initial architecture review, and then establish some targets and milestones, as well as start to put together the team with roles and responsibilities on the IT side as well as the business side. As you move into analysis and planning, we often find that it's helpful to do a really detailed inventory, looking at all of the different types of content that you have published in detail and coming up with a plan for what you want to migrate and how you want to migrate it, as well as really looking in depth at your current architecture in a way, almost a health check to assess what's working and what's not working well. And from this, also work to define your new target architecture. This will all inform the appropriate migration method, which Sam will talk about here in a moment. There's a number of different options at your disposal for how to do that, and really put together a detailed plan for how you're going to go about this. As you look to execute the migration, you'll want to prepare your source system, which may involve some things like cleanup, prepare your target system, which involves actually deploying or implementing the system in your target environment, conducting the migration, and then verifying the migration. And at this point, you're migrated, although your work isn't necessarily done. Once you're migrated, there may be some additional types of modernization that you want to do, after that migration. But perhaps most importantly is to make sure that not only are things documented, but that you put in place the appropriate governance, which could be technical operations and procedures for operating this new environment, which might be especially important if you've moved to the cloud and maybe you're relatively new to the cloud, but also putting in place content or data related governance and people and process governance to ensure that you're able to take your new system to the scale that you're looking to take it.
All right, so thanks to Whit for providing a really good overview of the strategy around this process. I want to reiterate that all the things we're talking about here are really built from our actual work with all of you as users and our customers. And so we built this strategy based on not only years of doing these migration kind of projects, but also seeing the changing trends, changing requests, and trying to build a practice around that we can then share back to you in venues like this. So I'm gonna try to dive deeper on a couple of topics that Whit covered already, and give you an example of how we approach these things, as well as get into the actual technical procedures we use and can recommend to you. So first, to kind of expand on one of the topics from the last slide around a migration plan, one thing we found is that one of the best ways to ensure success in this process is to write a detailed plan, follow through to completion, and use that as your record of the work that you did. And so a migration plan can, of course, take many forms, but one way to think about it is in these kind of categories. So first, try to capture detailed information about your source and target environments. As we said, migration is usually referring to a one-time A to B migration, not a multi-step or multi-environment kind of workflow. And in this case, as you go through, the kind of questions that you're going to get hit with during the process often relate to low-level system components, to URLs, and to your own configuration. So the more you do to record detailed information about server names, the DNS aliases that you use, the specifications of the hardware, as well as how you're using the ArcGIS software in each different environment, all these things contribute to you having a really clear and holistic understanding of all the different pieces you're going to be moving. And that helps you make sure that you actually move the right things to the right places and you don't forget something in the process. Another key part of that is data location, right? So are your services published from a relational geodatabase? Are they hosted services in the ArcGIS data store? Or are they referencing locations on disk or imagery in some kind of other storage? All these things are important in knowing that your new environment can see and access the same kind of content. After laying out that kind of detailed background information, also lay out all the pieces. So look at the different steps you're going to go through. And this can be a comprehensive listing that includes things like testing or piloting, as Whit referred to. It's a great idea to actually try out the software in a new environment first to get some of those kinks out. But those individual steps you're going to take, starting from how do I back up my data store and ending with how do I notify my users that the system is back up and running again. Those sets of steps, which can be many and many pages long, is a lot of work up front, but it really results in a very clear and methodical process that helps you be more successful in that outcome. And also through that process, you can mark up open questions you have, action items, issues you run into during the process. This is a great way to make sure you get all of your questions answered before you actually dive in, and don't get halfway and realize you forgot to figure something out and have to go roll back and start again from scratch. And now that you have this great plan that goes to all the different pieces of the migration process, we also recommend that you use that when you move into the act phase. So as you go through, mark off each step. I like to highlight each step in that outline in the nice green, bright highlight when I finish it. But use that to take notes on the things you run across. If there's an issue that you hit, it's something you want to fix later, take a note of that so you don't forget about it, and make sure that you're able to follow up on those things later on. And again, this whole migration process and the plan is a really key part in that it also provides an output of what you've done. So if you want to ever walk somebody through, a colleague or your management, walk them through what you did and show all these different steps that it took, now you have a very clear record of all the actions that you took during that process. So once we know a lot about our source environment, we know what we want to have in the target, we understand capabilities we want to add, changes we want to make, all the things that Whit already covered from a strategy perspective, how do we actually do that? And we're going to go through 3 common methods that we've seen used and that we support using to do this kind of migration work. The first method is the WebGSDR tool. So WebGSDR is a tool that's been in the software for many years that was originally designed to be used for supporting disaster recovery or DR scenarios. Disaster recovery describes a scenario where you want to maintain a separate or failover environment that has all the same functionality and ideally the same content and users as your source environment, so that if you ever have a hardware failure, a network outage, some kind of issue in your data center, you can basically fail over immediately and everything is still there that your users just recently published. And so this can be a very complicated process with a lot of different components. WebGSDR was built to do that, but it can also be used as a tool to allow you to migrate, which I'll get into in more detail. Join site is another off-the-shelf method. We support high availability modes for all 3 major enterprise components. So you can have a 2-machine highly available portal site. You can use ArcGIS Server in a multi-machine configuration and have been able to do that for many years using common storage and a shared config store and directories. And you can also use ArcGIS Data Store in a highly available configuration. And the join site method uses this concept of high availability in a temporary fashion to allow you to migrate to new hardware by putting everything in an HA configuration, moving your content to a share, and then eventually breaking HA and leaving only the new server behind. And the last major category of migration methods is around scripting and tools. Whether this is the Python API, which provides some great options for migrating content and users, or tools from our partners like GeoJob, or tools we've built like AGO Assistant, There are lots of options out there for doing maybe more carefully designed migrations or more piece-by-piece migrations. We'll get into where those are a good fit in a minute. So the DR tool, as I mentioned, was designed to really take a backup en masse of your entire system and then redeploy the same exact content somewhere else. And so it's important to recognize that WebGIS DR is an all-in-one kind of operation. It backs up all the settings, all of your portal content, all the services in your federated servers, as well as everything in your relational and tile cache data stores. On the right, you can see a great table from our documentation. It just kind of shows that as we've developed the tool over time, starting at 10.4, we've tried to reduce the number of things that had to match in the target environment. And the reason this is useful is that WebGIS DR can be a great way to change your architecture or change your deployment in some way during the migration. So you might take a DR backup from a single machine site and restore to a multi-machine site, or take a DR backup from one where your portal and server are separated and restore to one where you're all in one server in the cloud. There are many different ways you can do that, but as you can see on the right, we've tried to reduce over time how many things have to exactly match before you do that migration. Do note, though, that WebGIS DR does not back up a few important things. If you use a lot of content in an enterprise database or an SDE database, note that that does not get pulled across. You have to make sure that that same database, same name, and same contents is available in the target environment for those services to be restored properly. The traditional tile cache services like a map service cache or an image service cache, because of size, are also not brought along. Those can be copied manually after the fact. Any registered data on file shares, as well as geo-event services or the spatiotemporal data store, are also not provided as parts of this backup. And there are individual methods for those individual components. We see that the vast majority of users are pretty well served by this kind of scenario. The join site method, as I mentioned before, relies on putting your environment in a temporary state of high availability and then breaking that HA, leaving behind your second environment. So it's important to note that this does require a shared network environment. This is not a good fit for moving from on-prem to the cloud, because in the HA state where you have one server on-prem, one in the cloud, both trying to talk to each other and use the same file share, as you can imagine, that can be pretty problematic. It also can introduce some downtime during migration. When you put the portal in high availability mode, if you don't have your load balancer set up to route traffic to both portals and to handle that kind of traffic, things can get kind of confused for a period of time as you're in that temporary HA state. So it is, in general, more impactful to the source environment in that you're actually making changes to the source, whereas WebGIS DR is really not changing anything about the source environment. It's just creating that backup file. And then in the realm of scripting and different tools, I think it's fair to say that using these kind of methods does require a more intimate knowledge of all that content we talked about earlier. So that content inventory, what are we using? How are others using the system? What kind of items are they creating? Are we using insights extensively or not using it at all? Are we using dashboards, web app builder, experience builder, all these different apps that we support through ArcGIS Enterprise? Knowing how those are used is the biggest ingredient in how to actually use Python to make progress. This usually works in not as much of a holistic process, but more iteratively, whether you go user by user and move all their content or group by group. Because of the way that items are created in the target, it often creates new item IDs, where both WebGIS DR and the join site method retain item IDs in the migration. But it also gives you some increased control over things you might change during the process. So you can migrate selectively, but you can also choose to update web maps, introduce new tagging systems, make changes in the process, right? Whereas WebGIS DR and join site are really trying to get everything over there, then you make changes. And so with these three methods that are all relatively different, a natural question is, well, which is the right one for my scenario? And of course, that answer is going to be, it depends, but I think we can give you some general guidance on how to think about these things. WebGIS DR is really a great option when you want to move everything all at once in one step. What's great about WebGIS DR is that once you set up your target environment to receive that backup, you can do that restore operation, and then you can rerun and re-restore as many times as you want at the same release. As long as you're going from 10.6.1 to 10.6.1, you can keep re-restoring content. That lets you test the new environment more comprehensively while not interrupting users in the source environment yet. It also handles those architecture changes like single to many machine sites, which is great, as well as being able to move across networks. So you can use this to migrate from on-prem to the cloud, where join site can't support that. And I'll also say it has the lowest impact on production in that until you're ready to actually do the restore, there's really no downtime to the production system. When you take that WebGIS backup, that final one where you want to move across and migrate, you need to tell your users that it's time to stop creating content for a few hours. But the system stays up and available. They can see their apps. They can make edits to geodatabase back feature services, all these kind of things they want to keep doing. That downtime is pretty limited. For join site, this is a great option for migrating within the same network for scenarios like you just want to keep everything the same but upgrade the operating system, right? Deploy a new Windows VM at the latest OS, use join site, move things across, and call it a day. It also allows you to move one component at a time. Let's say you want to only migrate your server and data store off of an all-in-one machine, leaving the portal there. You have more flexibility to do piece by piece with the join site method, whereas WebGIS is everything all at once. And then scripting obviously gives you that full control over item by item options. So you can move specific content users and groups, however you want to do that in the many ways that are relevant to you. It also gives you the opportunity to adjust content or make changes in flight. And I think the main downside is that it does create those new item IDs when you move the content. And so if you have users who have links to a specific item with the ID in that URL, or complicated relationships between items, you want to make sure that you actually maintain those things when you make the change. So lastly, I think, what if these are not enough for you, right? So what if these are not a good fit or you need more assistance? Sometimes these tools are going to be a good idea, but they either don't work or aren't a good fit for your situation. And we think of those as more complex or more advanced migrations. The takeaway I would have here is all the pre-work we've talked about, all that planning step, all the migration planning work that you do around content, user workflows, et cetera, all of that is super relevant to regardless of whatever method you take to go forward. So any work that you do ahead of time to clean up content, reduce the scope of the migration, focus it on certain servers, carefully design your target, that's all still relevant to whatever method you take. And if you need assistance on this, we welcome reaching out to us, right? Work with Esri, work with our partners. We can support you in these more complicated scenarios. We have lots of people who've worked through these things many times, and we can assist in a variety of different modalities too. So we can provide you advisory support, right? Reviewing your plan, giving you advice. We can work hand in hand with you on the actual migration itself, or we can bring our people in and do it as a turnkey process where you have a lot of confidence in the result. So there's a lot of different ways we can work with you. Maybe one last just note, we've also continued to keep improving the product in this area. And so we've added some new functionality at recent releases, like at 10.8, the ability to export a group worth of content and re-import it, as well as all the work around distributed collaboration over the last few years. These are things where we keep also improving the product and adding to these methods over time to give you more options that you can use to affect these migrations. Let's get into our top 5 most common questions about migration. And of course, these are gathered from our feedback from users and the work that we've done. We look forward to your additional questions following the session. First might be around upgrades, right? So a common question would be, should I upgrade my deployment before or after migrating? A couple different ways to look at this. It really depends on how much impact you can make on your users, how much downtime you can afford. If you're going to use a WebGIS method or join site, it's fair to say that there's been increasing numbers of things that you can have flexibility around in those pieces of software. I showed that chart earlier, right, of WebGIS. So there's a benefit to upgrading first before you do that backup, because you can then deploy to a more different or less similar environment at a newer release of WebGIS. Since you go from the same environment, same version to same version in the target environment, there's some benefits to that. But that also introduces some uncertainty and also some downtime for users. So I would say my recommendation is, if possible, if you're at a relatively recent release like 10.6 or higher, take that WebGIS backup and restore at the same release and then upgrade in your target environment. You can then test your upgrade, make sure all that works smoothly, add new functionality, validate things, all before you make that DNS change and swap over your environment. And so there are, of course, different options here, but that's one way to look at it that works really well for us. Another question comes in around the hypervisor level. So many of you are running ArcGIS Enterprise on virtual machines, no longer on physical hardware. And lots of VM providers offer really great tools to move software at the virtual machine or hypervisor level between data centers, between hosts, many different ways, between networks, et cetera. Things like Azure Site Recovery come to mind. So these are good options if you really have somebody who knows your domain and your IP space and your networking really carefully. These can be really good options for you because you can basically move smoothly closer to that kind of lift and shift methodology and then re-enable those servers in the target environment. I think this is worth looking into if you do have that kind of advanced IT support and somebody who can handle the kind of questions around name resolution, IP addresses, and host names that are going to be key to this. I'd say if it works great, but you have to know a lot to get it working properly. We often get requests now to upgrade different operating systems as we've reduced our support for older operating systems, as Microsoft has dropped support for them. We have environments that are running older versions of our software on older OSs. So, right, how do I do that migration? I mentioned earlier that if you're just looking to do this, that the join site mechanism can be a great way to do this. Join site relies on things like UNC shares and network connectivity that haven't really changed that much from release to release. And so you can use the join site method to move from a Windows Server 2008 to Windows Server 2016 pretty easily by going to that temporary HA status and going forward. And then with WebGSDR and more kind of holistic moves, you actually don't even need to worry about the OS at all because the software version is what counts. And so you can very, very easily use that to move between different releases of the software. Do note, though, that none of these methods support moving from a Windows-based environment to a Linux-based supported operating system. None of these options are really available for that at this time. Distributed collaboration is something that we introduced around the 10.5 era of enterprise to allow users to push or pull content from different systems to different systems, right? So if you have a multi-enterprise deployment in your organization, how can you share authoritative services and content from portal A to portal B or to online for your public users when you're authoring it locally in enterprise? It's a great mechanism for moving content around when you want to be able to control it from one place and have others receive that. And the model's built around really a host and a guest system in a way that really makes it not perfectly suited for collaboration. And so the quick answer is it's not a good fit for collaboration. The reason for that being that when you recreate content through collaboration in a target system, it may look like it exists independently in that target system, but really it's tied back to the source. And it's this concept of host and guest that leads to the reality that if you then remove that content from the source system, it's going to be removed from the target environment automatically. And so migration or distributed collaboration can be a great way to bring content into a new system, highlight it, share authoritatively, reduce the duplication of content, but we don't view it as a migration tool. And last question, which is probably worth its own presentation entirely, and maybe we'll get to that next year at the UC or the Dev Summit, is really around how do you smoothly promote or release content through multiple environments. We have lots of organizations that have been using a dev test prod or dev staging prod kind of workflow for many years. And it's still a very valid deployment mechanism for testing things like upgrades or new releases. With content, it's more complicated, right? The interest in maintaining item IDs and relationships as you move maybe once or maybe multiple times from dev to test or from test to prod is pretty complicated. And while some of these migration tools can be used to, for example, snapshot an environment back to an earlier, a lower environment rather, it's not really a comprehensive approach to this. And so the recommendation we can make about promotion and release here is to really focus on the business processes you want to support, right? Which content, how often, who initiates it, where does it go, how is it managed? These are the things you want to get really carefully narrowed down or nailed down to define how you approach this from a software perspective. We're happy to answer some more questions about this later on in the Q&A. Whit, back to you.
Thanks, Sam. If we step back and revisit this question of why do I want to migrate? We suspect that for many of you, the answer is we want to put ourselves in a better position to scale the use of WebGIS across our organization. So as we wrap up the session, we wanted to share our top 5 best practices for doing that, for taking your WebGIS to scale. The first is really about this session, to use migration as an inflection point. Before you proceed with the migration, stop and think about how you've used GIS to date. What's worked well, what hasn't worked so well, and what do you think you should change in order to make better use of the GIS across the organization? So use migration projects as a way of modernizing your use of WebGIS. The second best practice really deals with this topic of publication strategies. We strongly encourage you to evolve your use of services, and service types, in addition to the larger geoinformation model, the different item types within the portal, because a lot has changed. In fact, we'd encourage you to check out a session that was given at Developer Summit this year around best practices for publishing layers and services. You may not realize all of the changes that have happened. For example, feature services have really been supercharged in the last couple of years around performance and scalability. The third best practice is really around governance, which is to sort of acknowledge that successfully rolling out enterprise systems across an organization, of course, requires technology, but it also requires people and process. We think it's important to take a hard look at your operational procedures, the roles and responsibilities, as well as other governance related aspects to ensure that you're able to not just take your WebGIS to scale, but to operate it successfully as it grows in use. Architecture is also hugely important to taking your WebGIS to scale, especially as we talk about ArcGIS Enterprise. We strongly encourage you to really think about your target architecture in migration, follow best practices. We'll have a document we'll share in just a moment, which lays out some best practices for architecting ArcGIS Enterprise, and to lay down a good foundation that can support evolving business needs. So we can acknowledge that IT changes, you may need to scale and evolve with the use of technology, but having a strong foundational architecture will really enable that flexibility as you move forward. And lastly, as it relates to the release of softwares, we often get a question, how often should I release? The Esri software does change quite a bit from release to release. We release a lot of new capabilities as well as address a lot of change and in some cases bugs. We really do encourage you to stay up to date with the latest releases. I would say that our most successful and sort of mature users of ArcGIS Enterprise tend to target annual upgrades, not necessarily as a rule, but as a general guideline. And in a lot of cases, they do that on the .1 release, sticking with the long-term support releases. So as we wrap up, one last and important thing we wanted to reiterate and to leave you with is to think about enterprise and cloud migration, not as a singular event or activity that's either hard or easy, something you start on a Monday and you finish on a Friday, but to take this opportunity to really reflect, ask the question why, and approach the migration strategically and proceed thoughtfully with this understand, plan, and act approach. So we really want to thank you all for tuning into the session. We have a few useful resources we think you might want to take advantage of. In the top left, we have a public-facing landing page that you can access on the Esri.com website that introduces this topic at a high level, talks about this this journey and the strategy, this high-level approach, and also has a link to a white paper that goes into a bit more detail and is sort of suitable for a number of different audiences, not just technical, but also business and leadership. On the top right here, we have the Architecting the ArcGIS Platform Best Practices white paper, which as you haven't seen, we'd strongly encourage you to look at. It takes a conceptual look at a number of different aspects to architecture and is going to be really important, as you look to design your target system. And the one on the bottom, this is a very specific thing, but perhaps an underappreciated set of changes made in the platform in an area where you can really best leverage what's available in ArcGIS Enterprise. This is about an hour session that was given at the Developer Summit earlier this year and really gets into these feature services and vector tile services and map service type discussion. Thank you very much for tuning in.